Good evening. There we go. Good evening. My name is Mary Kate Carey, and I'm the director of Think Again here at the University of Virginia. On behalf of our co-sponsors, Heterodox Academy at UVA, the Fund for Free Expression and Viewpoint Diversity, and the UVA Office of Engagement, I'd like to welcome you. I'd also like to welcome the many, many people who are watching from our UVA family all across the world who are joining us by live stream tonight. So I'd like to welcome them to Cabell Hall. And most of all, I'd like to thank the many volunteers who helped us pull this tremendous event together. So thank you to our volunteers. It was Thomas Jefferson, the writer of the Declaration of Independence, one of the founders of our nation, who first started talking about the importance of education to a thriving democracy. And so it is an honor for us here at UVA to be hosting this conversation tonight. Earlier this afternoon, we convened a tremendous group of free speech leaders here at UVA from all over the country who were involved on the ground in higher education, promoting a culture of free speech. And as Jonathan Haidt coined the phrase a few years ago, we talked about how to restore the telos of the university. And the telos is the aim or the purpose of great universities. And to us, the aim of a great university is the idea of pursuing truth. And we think that is important for great universities, and more importantly, we think that's important for our democracy. So before we leave tonight, before we finish our conversation, we're going to ask Jonathan to sort of recap what we caught this afternoon from these free speech leaders, and we'll be convening them again tomorrow, and we're going to capture all of their wisdom and try and share it widely afterwards. So before we start our conversation tonight, I'd like to start with a question, which is, how did the free speech movement in higher education first start? And the answer is what you're about to see, and it is a short documentary brought to us by Paul and Ellen Wagner, who are here tonight, Oscar-winning filmmakers and UVA professor, and you will see their answer to this question of how did we start? So let's let our documentary roll, and as the lights go down, please silence your cell phones and no recording, please. Thank you.
Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water.
In 1964, Mario Savio, a young college student from Queens, New York, volunteered for the Mississippi Freedom Summer, going door to door to register black voters. Savio suffered a beating by the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, but he was the lucky one. 3 of his fellow volunteers were murdered.
Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech, that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right.
That fall, Mario returned to school at the University of California, Berkeley, joining many other students inspired by the moral clarity of the civil rights movement. But when they began to participate in civil rights demonstrations around San Francisco, the university cracked down and banned all political activity on campus. October 1st, a group of defiant students set up tables on a campus plaza to raise funds and recruit volunteers for the civil rights movement. One of them, Jack Weinberg, is arrested by the campus cops and thrown into a police car. And the students have what they want, a confrontation with the administration over the new rule forbidding political activity on campus. A large crowd gathers, and someone yells, "Sit down." Suddenly, hundreds of students are blocking the car. One of them approaches the police to ask if he can stand on the car and address the crowd. The cop says it's okay if he takes off his shoes. Mario Savio climbs atop the car in his socks and rallies the crowd to a compelling cause. College students are American citizens with the absolute right to speak freely under the First Amendment of the Constitution.
I'm not here to destroy something. We're all here to try to build something. Why don't you help us?
Overnight, for 32 hours into the next day, the students block the car and make speeches. Jack Weinberg, still stuck in the back seat, has to pee in a bottle. Beyond the plaza, hundreds of policemen prepare tear gas and clubs. But the next day is Parents' Day, with visitors expected on campus. So the administration agrees to negotiate. The students release the police car, and a new student group called FSM, the Free Speech Movement, is born.
Tables have been permitted out in front of Bancroft and Telegraph to distribute literature. The effect of cutting this off is to stop political activity on this campus.
The remarkable thing about this entire situation, there's been a coalition from Youth for Goldwater all the way over from the Young Socialist Alliance. Now, I'm proud to say that American students are united on one issue, and that's the First Amendment privileges of freedom of speech, the right to advocate and discuss at any time, at any place.
And they took the position that we want to undertake these activities on campus property itself, and we said this is not possible.
The president of the University of California was Clark Kerr. Kerr thought of the university as a knowledge factory for the mass production of students.
If this is a firm, and if President Kerr, in fact, is the manager, and I tell you something, the faculty are a bunch of employees, and we're the raw materials. But we're a bunch of raw materials that don't mean to have any process upon us, don't mean to be made into any product for human beings.
December 2nd, Mario Savio speaks on the plaza in front of Sproul Hall, the Berkeley Administration Building.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart, that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Inspired by Savio's speech, over 1,000 students now enter and occupy Sproul Hall in an act of mass civil disobedience. They remain overnight, sharing a meal, talking politics, and watching Charlie Chaplin movies. The next day, the police enter and arrest 700 of them. The students go limp and peacefully accept their arrest, adopting the nonviolent tactics of the civil rights movement. 4 days later, 16,000 people gather on campus at the Greek Theater. President Kerr endorses a statement from the chairman of all the academic departments restricting the free speech of students. Mario Savio rises to speak in opposition, but suddenly he is seized by the police. The brutal tactics shock many people in the crowd, including many members of the faculty. The next day, the faculty meets to consider the adoption of a new free speech resolution. Thousands of students listen to the debate.
Moves the following propositions. 1, that the time, place, and manner of conducting political activity on the campus shall be subject to reasonable regulation to prevent interference with the normal functions of the university. 2, that the content of speech or advocacy should not be restricted by the university.
All in favor of the motion, please indicate by saying aye. Aye. Contrary, no. The motion is carried.
The victory of the free speech movement comes on December 8th, Mario Savio's birthday.
No restrictions on the content of speech save those provided by the courts. And that's an enormous amount of freedom. And I'd like to say, at this time, I'm confident that the students and the faculty at the University of California will exercise their freedom with the same responsibility they've shown in winning their freedom.
Perhaps the FSM was so successful because the principles of the free speech movement were truly American principles and on the leading edge of a massive political wave. Within a year, students were demonstrating against the war in Vietnam and fighting for the rights of American women. Free speech would prove to be the key that unlocked a revolution in American politics.
Wow, Paul and Ellen, just an amazing job. I think I see another Oscar in your future. Let's have a round of applause again for Paul and Ellen. Great, great job. As you probably just saw, that was done with great support from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, also known as FIRE. And we heard from Tyler McQueen this afternoon about their strategy for distributing this nationally over the next 3 months and getting it in front of their millions of followers and then spreading it to schools all over the country. So we've got a great plan ahead of it for that. At Think Again, we stand for 4 pillars, and we do student-facing programming to support those pillars. And our 4 pillars are freedom of speech, diversity of viewpoints, intellectual humility, and critical thinking. And as we talked tonight in this conversation about where we go next with this, I cannot think of 2 people who embody those 4 values more than the 2 people you're about to hear from. So let's start our conversation. I'd like to introduce to you the founder of the Free Press, Bari Weiss, and the former governor of Indiana and former president of Purdue University, Mitch Daniels. Please give them a warm welcome.
Thank you all so much.
Why'd we wait so long to do this, Bari?
I don't know. I met you once, but you don't remember me.
I remember. You're unforgettable, and the audience is about to find out. As a matter of fact, you know, one of my favorite beers used to have my very favorite ad campaign, the most interesting man in the world, you know. I'm going to call Dos Equis and tell them they need to bring that back with you. Because you quite possibly are the most interesting woman. And we got a lot of ground we want to cover in the allotted time, but I think we'd be cheating this audience if they didn't get to know you a little bit. So let me just start with a question which is not as lame as it may sound. You know,
who are you?
Exactly, who are you? You know, in a world where it seems everyone either wants to be or is assigned to a tribe, assigned a label. You know, an identity. You are impossible to typecast, and because you are many things. So tell us a little bit.
Well, I guess if I filled out some census survey, you would find out that I'm gay, that I'm a mother, that I'm Jewish, that I'm the oldest of 4 daughters, that I grew up in Pittsburgh, that I'm an American. Those would be some of the things on the checklist, and I'm sure everyone in this room has their version of those things. But you know, if I'm interesting at all, and that's very kind, I don't think I'm that interesting. I think maybe it's a sign of the times that I'm viewed as interesting, and let me explain what I mean by that. I think that, you know, I don't believe that any of those markers of my identity should tell you anything about what's going on inside my head. In other words, why should any of those markers tell you what I think about any number of issues? And I think we're living in a moment right now where a lot of people believe that your identity not only trumps your ideas, but determines your ideas, tells you what a person believes, tells you about their character, tells you actually about their value. And that is a politics, I would say, that I fundamentally reject. And the fact that I reject it tells you more, and that feels exceptional in some way, I think tells you about this moment in American life, a moment that I think we've lived through since about 2014. I mean, Jonathan Haidt has written about this better than anyone else. If you guys don't know him, you have to read all of his books. And I think maybe that we're starting to emerge from it. And I will hopefully, over the next decade, seem far less interesting to people, and I will view that as a victory.
Well, you'll only be less interesting if you become, as you are already, I think, a model for others. I think your critics find it frustrating that they can't put you in a box, they can't predict your next viewpoint based on some characteristic they assign to you.
Well, I think one of the things happening right now, and maybe people in this room, adults or students, resonate with this, which is we're living in a moment in which the political center feels like a shrinking island, and all of the incentives are there to sort of rush into the tribe of the left or rush into the tribe of the right. And that feels safer, frankly. And I regard myself as politically homeless, as part of the large majority of, I think we're actually the majority of people in this country who don't align with what used to be called right and left, who don't align with what used to be called Democrat and Republican, who understand that we're living through a pretty radical realignment, and see a lot of tearing down that's happening, but also in my more optimistic moments, the opportunity for building things anew, which is what I'm trying to do.
And to build a culture in which people feel more emboldened to say what you just said and to express their dissatisfaction with either tribe. So our assignment tonight is free speech, so we're going to broaden a little beyond that, but we want to start there. I've had trouble deciding, watching, a lot's been going on the last year. Many schools have discovered free speech principles and at least articulated them, whether they're going to live up to them or not. They've discovered both the virtue and the safety of institutional neutrality, and there are signs of hope. But I'm having trouble deciding whether we've gained ground or not, because for every win I can see a setback. But tell me what you think.
Well, it was really interesting watching Mario Savio in that little film, because one of the things that strikes me looking back at that incredible footage is that the people are waving American flags, right? The left in those videos are waving American flags and appealing, as Nadine Strawson was saying in the voiceover, to truly American principles. In other words, their appeal for their protest and the things they were protesting for were about perfecting the Union, were about reifying their First Amendment rights as students, all things that are uniquely American. If you think about many of the protests, and I'm so curious what's been going on at UVA over the past year, but many of the schools that I have spoken at and visited, many of the young people that come and work at the Free Press, they're on campuses where the people who imagine themselves to be the inheritors of the people you just saw in that film are waving the flags of terrorist organizations and cheering on the behavior, I guess you could call it, the terrorism of America's enemies. And it's just so strange how that has morphed. So that's one thing that I was just thinking about coming into this conversation. Look, on the one hand, I think if you look at the number of schools, and I know we're at the #1 school according to FIRE for free speech, this one? I think Purdue is number 3. No shade, no shade. So I think a lot of schools are adopting the principles of the Calvin Report, the Chicago principles that I know UVA has adopted. I know Purdue was the first public university to adopt them. And I think, after the sort of chaos, and frankly a lot of the law breaking of this past year, universities are maybe saying to themselves, hold on, we let this go too far. We sort of let the inmates run the asylum, and we need to regain control. We need to regain not control, but just sanity and civility. So on the one hand, every other day, it feels like you have a university president standing up and saying the things that you, Governor, and that the president at UVA have long been standing up for. So that, on the one hand, is a good thing. On the other hand, if you think about what creates a healthy culture of free speech, and free speech is sort of a limited way of talking about it. Free speech is a tool for the pursuit of truth. It is the tool that we use in democratic societies to persuade each other, to get to truth, and to resolve conflict. Because what is the other tool that was used for the majority of human history? Violence. Speech is the replacement for violence, which is why it is so essential. And that is our key tool, and that's why it's so important, but it's really a tool. If you think about, though, the culture that creates free speech culture, it's not just, a commitment on a piece of paper. It is people inside an institution that are guaranteeing that culture. And if you're and many of this country's elite universities have this problem, if you're at a school where 99% of professors and administrators and even many students think the same way about the 20 most controversial issues in the country and in the world, well, you're not going to have much of an ability to debate because everyone thinks the same way. And that's where I think that ideological diversity, the importance of hearing other perspectives becomes enormously important. I'll say one last thing, which is there was a piece in The Economist recently that talked about wokeness, I hate that word, but wokeness having peaked. And on the one hand, you could say, well, maybe it has, because there's sort of less cancellations and less what I think of as digital witch burnings than there were maybe 5 years ago, certainly in the summer of 2020, which I think was kind of the high watermark of the panic. But on the other hand, I think another way of seeing it is maybe cancellations are less important now, because a few of them went such a long way into telling people what was acceptable and what wasn't, what could be said and what couldn't. And we don't really know, actually, if it's peaked, because we don't know the extent to which people are self-censoring themselves because of what they've witnessed.
We know it's happening. We may not know the extent, but we know it's there. And we know people, 62% in the latest measurement I saw, of all Americans, say that they are intimidated or hesitant to say what they think on many occasions. One of those, and I think we're going to have to stop using this adjective, but for now, elite universities you attended. And it's been in the news consistently, including just this week.
Berzite on the Hudson. No,
yeah,
it's
yeah.
Columbia.
So I want to ask you about Columbia, but first, if you had been president of Columbia last spring and then the previous fall, what would you have done differently?
Oh, wow. I love that question. Enforce the law. Start with that. The idea, for those of you who haven't followed that, there were many chapters to that story, but I think maybe the most emblematic image that came out of the protests that were actually pretty violent in the case of Hamilton Hall was an image of a trust fund man, to the manor born, has his own brownstone in Brooklyn, sort of pinned against the wall with a janitor who makes, his name is Mario, we've written about him, who makes, basically makes what it costs to go to Columbia in a year. And those students were holding these janitors, these custodians, hostage at the university. How that can be construed as being on the side of social justice, I will never know. But first, what I would say is enforce the law. All of the students who were barricaded in that in Hamilton Hall that broke property, that destroyed property, they were all, I mean, almost to a person let off. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is just being extremely clear as the university president about what the values of the university are. And yeah, free speech is an important aspect to that, and the distinction, I think, making the critical bright line distinction between speech and violence is very important, but also articulating what the deeper purpose of the university is, which is, frankly, to build citizens that can uphold and further civilization. That's really what it's about, and making clear that the student protest, you have a right as a student at Columbia to go and say, I love Hamas. I actually saw that sign a few weeks ago in New York that said, New Yorkers love Hezbollah, a person holding that outside of our office. You're entitled to do that in America, but if you run a university like Columbia, you should make it very clear that that kind of worldview that celebrates terror is not one that the university stands behind. And I don't think that that should be a problem. The fact that it was a problem for these people to articulate says a lot about them.
The simple distinction between speech and conduct can certainly be a part of this answer. And with you, I thought the critical moments were those when universities failed, first to enforce the rules as the rights of others were trespassed by conduct. And then later, having proclaimed that there would be penalties for that conduct, not, very quietly shelving that.
Well, and of course, the double standard here was unbelievable, because anyone that's paid attention to a school like Columbia, and I don't mean to single that out, it could be any school, knows that on these campuses right now, you can be censored, punished, your reputation damaged for the smallest microaggression. I'm thinking of a Native American student at Yale who was a member of the Federalist Society that invited people to come to a Constitution Day party that he called a trap house party. This was considered wildly offensive. He was hauled before the Yale University administration. They wanted to force him to apologize for an email. Okay, we remember the case, of course, in 2014 of Nicholas Christakis, whose wife had the gall to suggest that, it was another Halloween-related thing, that students could wear whatever Halloween costumes that they deemed fit. And for that, her and her husband ultimately resigned or were pushed out as the deans of their residential college. So this is the atmosphere that we're talking about, in which the smallest of microaggressions are policed and analyzed and, studied, and the people who, God forbid, make a mistake or say something inelegant or even say something that's misheard or even just say something normal that falls outside of the Overton window of what happens on campus, they're punished. They're punished aggressively. And yet, here were students breaking windows, occupying buildings, shouting in favor of Hamas, and then complaining that the university, in the case of Columbia, this was like so amazing, I couldn't believe it, wasn't providing them hot meals during their occupation. It's kind of a strange phenomenon.
But don't you understand that speech is violence and violence is speech?
Well, this new ideology likes to assert that speech is violence, but then they also believe at the same time that violence, when carried out by the right people in service of the right cause, is justice. And someone will at some point have to explain to me the oxymoron of an ideology that proclaims both of those things.
In a speech which I recommend to everybody I meet these days, we'll come back to it in a little bit, but just a very memorable speech to students at a brand new university she's associated with. You made the point that we've now all apparently learned that bullying is very bad unless you're bullying the right people, and then it's very good.
Yeah.
I want to ask about a specific corner of this because you have long history with this at Columbia and elsewhere, and that's anti-Semitism. You know, my first exposure, as when I thought back on it, to what we now call diversity, was moving from the American South to the American Midwest and into a very Jewish neighborhood.
What neighborhood?
Well, it was on the north side of Indianapolis. It was close to two temples. I went looking for a pickup baseball game. It was the middle of summer, and the games always wound up Goldberg, Cohen, and Silverberg, against Daniels and the Rifkin twins. And anyway, I watched those. I watched as the two of the three in the video, two of the three civil rights workers murdered in Mississippi were Jewish boys. On Halloween, when I was out practicing, minor vandalism, all my Jewish friends were out collecting money for UNICEF. UN is now a cockpit of anti-Semitism. But you experienced this at Columbia, and now we see it again, decoded for us. We've come to identify with victims, and usually we should. No one has been more victimized through history than the Jewish people, and yet
we have I'll say a few things. The first rule of thumb is that in times of intense transformation, in times of economic upheaval and technological upheaval, people feel insecure, and people want a clean, crisp, often two-dimensional explanation of why things are going wrong or why things are so confusing. And if you look throughout history, the tendency in those moments is the rise of anti-Semitism. And the reason for that, it's very hard to do this in like 2 minutes, but the reason for that is because anti-Semitism is the most ancient conspiracy in the world. It's similar in some sense to racism because it's bigotry against a particular group. But the difference is with racism, it's those people are lesser than me because of the color of their skin. With anti-Semitism, there's a twist. It says the Jews are both subhuman and superhuman. They are both communists and arch-capitalists at the same time. They are the people, and this is what the far right believes, they are people who, we're in Charlottesville. Why were they shouting, Jews will not replace us with the tiki torches? Because they believed in an ideology in which Jews are the handmaids of the undoing of America because they want open borders. And yet at the very same time, another group of people in this country believes that the Jews are uber white people. The only way to understand that paradox, or how all of those things can exist at once, is to understand the way that anti-Semitism functions. And it explains how under communism, Jews were the capitalists, and how now today, and here I get to the present moment, on the far left, which has a worldview that is highly racial, and believes that the world is only seen in terms of power relationships. Some groups are oppressors, some groups are oppressed, some groups are victims, some groups are victimizers. Now, as you said, Governor Daniels, if you look at Jewish history, you know which side the Jews ought to fall on there. If you just think about what has happened in living memory in Europe. And yet, according to this new worldview, the Jews fall on the wrong side of that binary. Because according to this worldview, Jews benefit from white privilege, they can pass. Jews, according to this worldview, have an inordinate amount of success relative to their numbers in the culture. And according to this worldview, the true measure of fairness is not equality of opportunity, but equality of outcome. And so any group that looks like they are benefiting more has done something suspicious or has done something unjust. And any group that is underperforming is somehow being victimized by an invisible system. The last aspect to this new anti-Semitism, which isn't really new if you look at the history of Soviet communism, but I think feels new to a lot of people who are only educated to learn about Hitler and Nazism, and certainly I was, is that the third sort of sin that Jews are guilty of, according to this new anti-Semitism from the far left, is that we are supporters of what they consider the last standing bastion of white colonialism in the Middle East, which is Israel. And so for all of those reasons, a group that should be considered and remembered for our long history of standing up for liberal and progressive causes, all of a sudden is not just cast out by the people that we imagined on October 6th to be our allies, but we're looked at almost as villains. And I think that, if there are any Jews here in this audience, I imagine there are some of you, I think it's one of the reasons that the past year has been so heartbreaking and confusing and alienating for so many people, because so many Jews have stood up for so many of the movements that have dominated the culture since the 60s and before that, and certainly over the past few years. And all of a sudden on October 8th, they looked around and the feminists weren't there, and any number of other groups weren't there either. And so it's been a painful, but I think also a very, very clarifying moment, because I think it's helped, at least me, remind myself that a politics that sees people as tribal rather than according to our merit and our character and the content of our character is always going to be dangerous, not just for Jews, but for any minority and frankly for the country itself.
And in the context that we're gathered around this evening, it produces another of these double standards or asymmetries in which language and conduct, which aimed at any other group would be immediately seen as hate speech and racist, has been excused and turned the other way. Those who, Jewish or those who would support them, are disqualified from speaking, some would say.
I think the other aspect to it, and I've thinking about this in coming to Charlottesville, is, one of the weird things about the way this illiberal ideology functions is it decides whether or not something is bad based on the identity of the perpetrator. Let me tell you what I mean by that. If I asked anyone in this room, what happened here with people marching with tiki torches, what did they say? You could tell me every single detail about it, right? And yet, for the past year, on college campuses across this country, there has been anti-Semitism, I would argue, probably more pernicious, certainly more violent, certainly more targeting of Jews, and yet that has been totally undercovered. I come from Pittsburgh. I went to Tree of Life Synagogue, where the massacre happened, where 11 of my neighbors were killed. I can tell you that everyone knows here that that was a neo-Nazi that carried out the attack, and so it was easy to condemn it because of the perpetrator of the victim. And it sometimes feels like we're almost waiting to find out the identity of the person before we can condemn their behavior as right or wrong. And I just think that that is a very, very dangerous road to go down. And I think it helps explain why there's been so much silence. Because what happens if you believe in a worldview in which there are oppressed and oppressors? What happens when a group or an individual from a group that you regard as oppressed is oppressing another person? It's very confusing, which is why we need to get back to the basics here, which is we judge people as individuals. We judge them not based on the sins or the virtues of their parents, but based on who they are and what they do in the world.
So all is not as we might wish it in higher ed. I guess we can agree with that. So my next question is, who best to fix it? The candidates include, I will not include the faculty who are at this point on too many campuses, too like-minded, having self-selected over multiple generations, and probably just can't free their minds to imagine
I met some good professors here.
Oh, there are, but let's just limit this to
they're like a beleaguered
the more
minority.
Realistic, possibilities, which would include presidents and administrators, boards of trustees, politicians, all of whom are...
Okay, so politicians are going to be last on my list.
Good.
I guess that's like the libertarian tendency in me.
Yeah.
And also, frankly, a lot of these bills that get put forward end up getting misconstrued, and that's the least of the good options, is that. The best option are people, I hate this word, but stakeholders in the university, students, parents, professors, I would include some professors, and donors helping to stand up for the virtues that make a university. And so I frankly think that the people, who decided to take back their money from places like Harvard or Penn were doing exactly what they should be doing. If the university that you're donating $100 million to is not upholding the values that make your donation worthwhile, why should you give money to that place? And, I think that that's one really powerful mode of expression.
Of course, if that institution is sitting on $30 billion already,
exactly.
It may or may not affect their behavior.
So I think the first and most important thing are the people inside of the school. I met some amazing students earlier today who are extremely committed to the kinds of values that we're talking about up here. The other thing is, starting new things. And I think for those of you who haven't heard of UATX, it's this new little school that I'm on the board of in Austin.
We're coming to that.
Okay, but the reason I mention it is only because I think that we're in a moment in American life where we need to be building new things, and that competition, like basic principle, competition leads to better outcomes. And frankly, if you look at the kind of movements that a lot of, the moving in the right direction, that a lot of university presidents that you've seen over the past few months, I think it's because of that.
Well, let's go ahead and talk about UT Austin, because it can be viewed as, as you just did, as simply creating a new model, an alternative, lighting one little candle that might spread. Or it could represent a mindset. I run into a lot of people who say it's hopeless. We simply give up.
It's hopeless. We should simply give up and not send our children to universities.
Yeah.
I hear that a lot too. I basically looked with my wife at our daughter, who's now 2, and we thought to ourselves, she also went to Columbia, and we thought to ourselves, there's no way in hell we would send our child there. And I was sick of being on Signal and WhatsApp groups with people complaining about the state of universities. And so despite the fact that I don't have a master's degree, I am not an academic by any means, I got involved with a few other people, the historian Neil Ferguson, the venture capitalist Joe Lonsdale, and a few others, on one hot day in Austin. You should never go to Austin in July. It was like 120 degrees. And we thought to ourselves, what would it be like if we, in a country with more than 4,000 colleges and universities, why don't we start a new one? Which seems insane, until you discover that so many of the most prestigious schools in this country have been completely captured by an illiberal ideology, and they have betrayed their mission, which is the pursuit of truth. And so what began as a conversation 3 years ago is now a real school that's raised more than $200 million with 95 students in the first class. Now, you could look at that and say, 95 students? Like, how many students are at UVA? Like, yeah, an enormous number, right? So you can look at 95 and say, what are you guys doing? That's crazy. But call me an idealist. I'm someone that really, really, really believes that a small number of people can transform the culture. I really believe that. I'm thinking about now in my mind the people that I believe are right now. And so if we can create, over the next year, and by the way, it's tuition free, which is pretty fantastic, at least for now. I really believe that if we can turn out 100 students, 400 over the next 4 years, mind you, it's not yet, it's going through the process of accreditation. You have to take a huge risk to go there, right? But who are the students that are going there? One of them just testified a few days ago in front of the Senate. She already made a documentary about cancer and the connection between dieting and cancer. These are some of the most unbelievable young people I have ever met in my life. I go to speak at a lot of universities. They are the most intimidating room I have ever sat in front of, except I'm sure this one. And I say that only because, 95 doesn't seem like a lot, but when I think about what these young people might do, the kinds of companies they might build, the kind of founders they could become, I feel just flooded with optimism. And maybe some of you in this room feel this way. I am just so sick of looking around and feeling like so many things are broken that even though I had no idea what I was doing in getting involved with this, even though, when I left the New York Times, I had no plan. I started a little blog. Now I have a company with more than 50 people. It's not because I'm like some secret genius entrepreneur. I didn't even know what ROI was when I started it. It's because I feel like we need to be called in this moment to what the country and frankly, like what history is asking of us. We're living in a country with a lot of broken things. Our universities, especially our elite universities, are one of those things, but there are many other things, media being chief among them. And I sort of view the choice in this moment as being not binary, but at least for me, it felt like I had one of two ways to go. Exit from the system and just kind of do something else entirely, like maybe open a B&B somewhere, which sounds really nice, or throw myself for the rest of my life into trying to build an institution that feels worthy, that in the case of the university, that lives up to the values of the university, and in the case of the free press, that lives up to the values of what journalism is meant to be about.
Well, millions of us are glad you made the choice you did, so don't change your mind. I've already touted the speech you gave down there. I'm going to try to further interest the audience by asking you not to go through all the, I think there were 10 maybe, principles you offered to potentially, as you said, the new founders. But just talk about 2 or 3 of them that are relevant. I mean, number 3 was defend free speech, but you made, I thought, an important point there that's not always made. That includes not only the freedom to speak, but the refusal to accept compelled speech.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've noticed over the past decade or so, and I certainly saw it in the newsroom at the New York Times where I used to work, but I've seen it in every corner really of American life, is people going along with things that they don't really believe because they're too scared of the reputational repercussions of not doing so. So I'll just give you one example. I remember when outside of the Museum of Natural History, there was a really wonderful sculpture of Teddy Roosevelt. And it doesn't exist there anymore. And that's because it was taken down in the name of, I guess, anti-racism. And I remember seeing that and thinking to myself, that's really bad, but do I really want to die on that hill? And looking back, I can think of so many moments where I said to myself, is it really worth it for me to stand up in this instance? Other people will take care of it. Or, Winston Churchill saved the West, but also kind of a racist, maybe not worth it. And you can go down, really, there's every person in all of history is flawed. Think about, Jefferson. Think about Jefferson himself, And I found myself sort of thinking about, like, why do we live in a culture where there's so much self-censorship, where there's such a chilled atmosphere around speech? It's because people did not choose enough hills to die on, and they were waiting for other people to stand up, and then no one does. And so there's 2 things I talk about in that speech. One is not to go along with lies. So when you hear that Winston Churchill is simply a racist, old British dead man, and not the man that saved the West, you should stand up and say something. When people say, that Lincoln was a villain and not the man that saved the Union, you should say something. When people say that America is just, a system of white supremacy and not the last best hope on earth that has allowed me and all of you to have privileges that our ancestors could not have dreamed of, you should say something. And I think that too many people go along with the easy lie, and those lies piled up so big until it almost became too late. And so free speech is not just about, the right to speech. It's about refusing to go along with compelled speech. Yeah. Another thing I talk about in that speech is standing up for burned witches.
My favorite of the 10, my very favorite, but so let me, in asking you to explain it, echo what you said. It was Churchill who said that courage is the essential virtue among all the virtues because it enables all the rest. And I thought came through your speech and all your recent work, so many places. But talk about why we need to defend witches, and who do you have in mind?
Well, I think J.K. Rowling is a good example of a person who was burned as a witch. We made a podcast that I'm really proud of at the Free Press called The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling with her that I highly recommend. And I have to admit that at first when I saw the hill she was choosing to die on, I was sort of befuddled. I was like, this is sort of a tangential issue, not sure, is this worthwhile? And in time, I sort of
You think everybody here knows what issue you're talking
about?
about?
I'm talking about, sorry. J.K. Rowling, if I can characterize her views, believes in total respect for transgender people, in rights for transgender adults, but has an issue with two things. One is the fast-track medicalization of young people who are often offered surgery and other kinds of hormonal treatments that can cause damage and that really can cause a transformation that they might not yet fully know, which is a conversation obviously happening in this country right now. And she's also been outspoken about the presence of biological men in women's prisons, which has led to all kinds of terrible things that you can imagine. Without getting into those specific issues, because I don't really know if that's what's significant, I think what's significant is the reason that she chose to die on the hill that she did had to do at its core about language. She noticed the way that women were being characterized by the illiberal leftist movement as being uterus havers, or as all kinds of other dehumanizing statements. And for someone like her, for whom language is so significant and so important, I think the reason she chose to die on that hill in the end was actually about the degradation of language itself. But I have to say, I watched it and I thought to myself, I don't want to go near that. I don't want to go near that. Why would I sort of waste my reputational capital on that?
Can I just make a point?
Please.
It was probably clear to you then, it's certainly become more and more clear as this issue has evolved, that it is not that you would be taking on the majority of your fellow citizens. 70 to 75% of Americans, and I think the Brits are actually ahead of us on this issue, agree with this point of view that as to children and so forth. And yet you felt intimidated.
Yes, because anyone, for one reason really, which is the internet. It'd be one thing if we were having this conversation in a world before social media, right, in which you and I could be at a dinner and disagree about any number of topics, and we'd go on with our lives. Now we live in a world in which that disagreement and the smears that could be thrown at you for disagreeing live with you forever. And one need only see the kind of treatment that one of the most famous, arguably the most famous author in the world was subjected to say to yourself, I'm not going near that. And in fact, I'm not going near any number of issues where that might happen to me. And so one of the things I talk about in that speech, The New Founders America Needs, is standing up for people that are being scarlet lettered, standing up for people who are being cast out as heretics.
Is it just the internet mob? I take that point, but also the sort of commanding heights of the economy, of the society, are dominated for the moment by people who are, let's take that example, are in the tend to agree with the 30%,
right,
as opposed to the 70%. That's another source of calumny and quite natural intimidation.
Yeah, it's the internet mob, but it's I talk now to kids as young as like 6th and 7th grade who tell me that they censor themselves on social media in front of their friends because they're projecting out into the future and imagining that they never want to have any record of any bad thought that might not even at this moment be a bad thought, but as we've seen, the way that the goalposts shift so radically, they're almost self-censoring for the future, which is an absolutely toxic reality. And so I think defending witches, not going along with compelled speech, understanding that integrity and standing up for the right values is not a scarce currency, but is something that you can give generously. I think that's been a huge lesson for me over the past few years. And then another thing I talk about in that speech is the the echoes of one courageous example can be so unbelievably profound. I think, we lived through a really intense pandemic in this country over the past years with COVID. But I think we're living through another kind of epidemic, and that is an epidemic of cowardice, of people sort of refusing or making the decision for the sake of social status or prestige, not to tell the truth, not to speak plainly, not to disagree in public, for fear of what it might mean for their status or their prestige. And yet, I also believe that in the same way that cowardice has been very contagious, I think courage can be as well. And when I think back to my own life, at like the really important hinge moments, the things that allowed me to maybe do the slightly more brave thing, it's because I had in my life, or at least in my memory of the past, really powerful examples of that. And of people who were willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of the good and the right. And so that's, I guess, one other message, which is courage is contagious. It's also very liberating. I've been thinking so much over the past year about how blessed I feel that I no longer work at the New York Times. And that truly, because I still am friends with a lot of people that work there, and the kind of contortions and the pretzel making that they need to indulge in order to keep their job is painful. And here I am on the outside, completely free. And I think that's one of the sort of like undervalued aspects to living in the heterodox world, which is that it's so much more fun. It's so much more fun to be free and to not worry about those things and to not be focused on getting invited to the right party, because you won't be, and instead be focused on the unbelievably exciting thing of building a new world. And that's been really the biggest blessing in disguise.
There are a lot of ironies. I always said if you're a fan of irony, higher ed's the place you ought to work. There are a lot of them. But just to center on one, years ago, as we were trying to make certain our university had its house in order on free speech issues, I invited people, a series of people to come speak about it. And to me, the most interesting were people like Jeffrey Stone from the University of Chicago and Nadine Strassen, who became a really good friend. And these were people, they were each really befuddled when I saw them, because they had grown up in the era of that wonderful documentary we saw. Free speech was the cause of the
liberalism.
Left and liberalism. And they felt pretty homeless and lonely now in a very different way, because now people with whom they still on many substantive issues might agree are the people who are trying to silence, to censor, to oppress those who have a different point of view. And they found themselves strange bedfellows with, the
friends
likes
with
of
conservatives.
Us. Yeah. What do you make? Do you see the same thing? And is this possible that this could be the seedbed of a new coalition that?
Yeah, we literally call it the reality-based community at the Free Press, or like the coalition of the sane. In other words, like for me, there are just basic table stakes. Like we could, I know that we disagree about so much, but those things that we might disagree on are secondary to the things we do, which is the ability to disagree with each other, the belief in speech as the tool for compromise and progress, and the idea of human dignity. I mean, there's many virtues that we could talk about that we agree on that I think allow for this conversation to happen in the first place. There's lots of people who think the same way I do about gay marriage, about abortion, about any number of issues, but who do not agree with me on the foundational virtues, and I have way less in common with them than I do with you. And that's been a very transformative realization for me, and frankly, disorienting. Like the disaffected liberal thing, yeah. That's me. It's been disorienting because, I found myself like speaking at the Federalist Society earlier this year, and I'm like looking at the list of people that have spoken there, and I'm like, you guys made a real mistake with me. Like, but the reason that I was there is because, again, even though I disagree with many people in that room on really important issues that are deeply important to me, I feel that we're at a critical moment in American life where alliances need to be made, unusual alliances, to protect core foundational values that are under tremendous threat from the right and the left. And protecting those things and renewing those things is just far and away the most important thing to me. And so once we've solved that, we can get back to fighting over social issues. But for now, for me, strengthening that bedrock that right now to me feels extraordinarily precarious, it's just priorities 1 through 10. And so I'll talk to anyone that agrees with me on those things.
To me, a closely related, a cousin to the censorship, to the attempts to silence differing views and so forth, is the corruption of language, or maybe I should say the appropriation of certain highly positive terms by one side of the argument. And it's bothered me that people who have acquiesced in that. I'll give you my two, I think the two most obvious examples: social justice and equity. The two classic, or I think two of the classic questions of philosophy for all time is what is just, and equity means fairness. What is fair? And yet those terms have been somebody has allowed them to be owned by one side of the argument. And was it Moynihan? Somebody said, "Who controls the dictionary tends to control the outcome," and I think we see that.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that this movement has been so successful is because it has hijacked words that are rightly siren songs to the ears of anyone that wants to be on the right side of history. So if you have a movement that's saying to you, we are for social justice, who wouldn't want to be on that side? We're for progress. Who wouldn't want to be on that side? We're for equity. Equity's fairness. Who wouldn't want to be on that side? We're for anti-racism. Well, sign me up. Who wouldn't want to be on that side? And yet, if you just scratch the teeniest bit under the surface, you discover that those words have been hijacked often, not always, really not always, but often to mean the opposite of their intended meaning. And so I think anti-racism is a very good example. There is no one in this room, I'm sure, who would not want to identify themselves as an anti-racist. And yet many of the policies and organizations that travel under that banner are actually trying to advocate for and stand up for a kind of neo-segregation. We wrote about one such man yesterday in the Free Press who, has been funded by many famous foundations and who believes that under the auspices of anti-racism that black students and white students should only be taught by black teachers or white teachers. How that is socially just and progressive and not something that we should be, from our history, that we should be deeply ashamed of, historians will have to decide how we arrived there. But that's why I think, I'm in the business of language. That is what we do. And so one of the things we try and do hard at the Free Press is really explain, when someone stands up and says they are pro-Palestinian, and yet they are advocating for the group, Hamas, that enslaves and kills and immiserates their own people, I don't regard them as using the proper language to describe themselves. And so I think connects a little bit back to the free speech question of being precise in your speech and making sure that when someone is saying something to you, that you don't just go along with the pablum because it sounds good and because it sounds just, but really asking the person, what do you mean when you say that you're on the side of social justice? What do you mean when you say equity?
Yeah, or to challenge whether the position they're espousing really qualifies for that term or not.
Right.
It may be the most unfair thing, and frequently is, for instance. So it's come up once already in one context. We're so fortunate that organizers were so wise to invite Jonathan Haidt to be with us, and he's going to be up here reporting in just a minute or two. But I want to ask you about other aspects of. He's our national tutor, as far as I'm concerned, in this swiftly emergent but yet dominant phenomenon that's overwhelmed us all in different ways. So, two things about it. Talk about political polarization. You talked about the intimidation that can come with the mob on your screen, but talk about political polarization and the extent to which this has accelerated what was already a...
You mean the internet accelerating it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, God. I mean, everything we've been talking about is shaped by what I'm sure Jonathan will talk about, which is the internet and the fact that we're living through a period not just of transformation, but of faster change than any other period ever before in human history. Like, everything needs to be understood through that lens. I think the polarization, it's hard to imagine it's hard to imagine life without social media and the internet and the way that it is polarizing us. I think the way that the mob connects to that is the incentive is to degrade the center to strengthen the extreme, and that's what we're seeing right now. And you're seeing it on the right with you're a rhino, you're not a real Republican. I mean, you see it intensely on the right, and you're seeing it on the left as well. So, I mean, in my tiny small way, what we're trying to do at the Free Press is to combat that. One of the ways we do that, and it's shocking coming from newsrooms where this wasn't possible, there are people in my newsroom who are voting for Trump, there are people in my newsroom who are voting for Kamala, and there are people who aren't voting at all. And that's normal and representative of America as a country. And I think when you look at our readership, it's representative of America as a country. And I think, in our small way, we're desperately trying to break the ideological bubbles that most of us live in most of the time.
If and I want to pursue that in the specific context of your current work and your previous employment. If one thinks, as I do, that the evaporation of objectivity in journalism, of balance, of the Edward R. Murrow view of the world, pursue the facts wherever they lead, report them. I say evaporation, I don't think it's too strong, that certainly the relative disappearance of that is a contributing factor to the speech environment and the overall environment that's so troubling. I learned the term, reading about you, audience capture. Yeah. Immediately understood what you meant, but talk about that and the ways in which it has rather quickly transformed the information coming to us as citizens.
It's impossible to answer that question without understanding the way that the economic model of news media has changed. 30 years ago, you had to be scared of pissing off your advertiser. Now you're scared of pissing off your reader. What do I mean by that? It used to be that the advertising was the model that upheld the New York Times and any other legacy publication you can think of. Now, what is the model? It's subscription, which has many unbelievable benefits. But what happens, and I'm not picking on the New York Times, it's just the model I know, when 95% of your readership, and that's the case at the New York Times, identifies as liberal or progressive? Well, you're gonna wanna give them things that are like political heroin. And the same rule applies if we're talking about Fox or MSNBC and any of the political directions those places go. In other words, you want to serve your audience because your audience is your business. And you know, and this was like the unsaid thing, but you just knew it because you saw the numbers. If you're an op-ed editor at the New York Times, you know that the audience is going to make viral and reward the 7,000th article about the threat of Donald Trump. And so guess what? You're going to be incentivized to commission and commission and commission and commission that. And it takes a tremendous amount of discipline. By the way, audience capture is the reality at the New York Times and also at the Free Press, and also if you're an individual Substack writer, because they're the ones paying your bills in the end of the day. So how do you fight that? There's lots of ways. One thing that we try and do at the Free Press is build a diverse audience and make sure that the newsroom is reflective of the audience, and we go out of our way to hire people from all kinds of backgrounds. You don't need a fancy college degree to be a journalist. You just need chutzpah and curiosity, and you need to learn how to write. So we really, really aspire to that. And also, we decide to publish things that we know are going to cause people to unsubscribe. But we do it because we believe in the long-term commitment to our reader and our audience. And what's that commitment? Trust, telling you the truth. It's very simple. What happened in the legacy press is that promise was broken as we don't have time to get into the whole history of it, but the mission of these places, not overall, not even the majority, but a loud minority has sort of hijacked the mission of these places where they truly no longer believe that the job of journalism is to hold up a mirror to the world as it actually is, so the audience can make informed decisions about their life, where they send their kids to school, what neighborhood they want to live in, and any number of other things. They believe the job of the journalist is to lead readers to the proper ideological and political conclusion, which is why certain stories are emphasized and certain stories are ignored. And again, you could pick on the right or you can pick on the left. It's the same story in both places. I truly believe that Americans are smart, that they are curious, and that the value of true journalism, which is telling you information you need to know, which is helping make sense of the world, which is offering you revelatory stories that help you give a sense of the country and the direction of the universe, that's still extraordinarily valuable to people. And I think that there's a huge, not just business opportunity, but frankly, civic responsibility to pursue that. And so that is what we're trying to do in a landscape, frankly, where not a lot of other people are trying to do the same thing.
Well, I've seen your growth rates, and it seems there is a market.
Yes, yeah, there is.
So I'm very hopeful. And by the way, that fancy college degree you talked about, maybe that's should be a disqualifier. I'm not sure. So I haven't felt the hook yet, but I got to, the clock in my head tells me that it can't be far away, and so I want to maybe end on this question. A fellow who is the current president of Johns Hopkins wrote a book. He's also thought a lot about what his university, how his university ought to be conducting itself and structuring itself around these questions. And he posed the question, what does a university owe to democracy? So let me ask you your answer to that.
Wow. I'm curious what his was, but I think mine would be to produce responsible citizens with a sense of duty and obligation to the country, and giving them the tools with the ability to do that. So not just uphold, I don't mean that in upholding the status quo and everything's perfect, but putting Americans into the world that understand the flaws of America, that understand the flaws of, the people that brought us the Enlightenment, but also understand their great good fortune to be the inheritors of those things. One thing, yeah.
Well, I mean, it presupposes things you talked about. You only can come to those judgments if you're properly educated, properly informed, if you've learned the history as it was.
Yeah, and I think we've done a very, very good job of teaching people how to deconstruct, and how to be unbelievably self-critical. I don't think we've done a very good job of inculcating virtues like, duty and gratitude that I think are essential to be in balance with those other things. And one thing, if we're gonna end, that I've been thinking about a lot since October 7th of last year is how thin the barrier is between civilization and anti-civilization. Barbarism. And how precious what we have in a liberal democracy like ours, how unbelievably precious it is, and how much it needs to be guarded and protected. Perfected, yeah, but also guarded and protected. And, this year's been intensely painful. I think for anyone that cares about, frankly, the fate of the free world. But I think it's also been clarifying in that it's maybe helped wake people up to the abundance that we have, to how precious it is, and maybe help people understand that they shouldn't really take it for granted.
Yeah. When I watched, I would say the worst of what we've seen over recent years, I characterized it as a combination of ignorance, arrogance, and ingratitude. You've touched on all of them. And the university can and should be the place where those things are defeated and dispelled. Ignorance by helping young people learn in its fullness, our history, the history of the world, and so they can make an honest comparison, which will learning how much they didn't know, if that happens, will lead to humility as opposed to arrogance. And I think ultimately to the gratitude you expressed so well about the good fortune we have to live in this richest, freest, safest world that by far that's ever been.
Most progressive in many ways.
All of that. Again, someone was wise enough and adroit enough to bring Jonathan Haidt to this meeting, and he was sharing his insights with students, I guess, today, and I'm told we'll give a brief readout, as we used to call it. Jonathan.
Good evening, everyone. It is a joy and a pleasure to be back here. I taught at the University of Virginia for 16 wonderful years. I love this place. I felt as though I worked for Mr. Jefferson when I taught here, and that we on the faculty, we were all engaged in his project of educating people for democracy, as Bari and Mitch were just talking about. I think Mr. Jefferson would be extremely pleased with what he saw, what we've done here today and what we heard from our speakers. And I think another thing, just, obviously there's a lot of UVA alumni and fans in the audience and online. I just want you to reflect on something really delicious, which is in last December and at the end of last year, we were all focused on Harvard University and its travails and the way that fire had to dig a new sub-basement on their scale in order to rank Harvard as a school with a good speech climate. And now here we are, less than a year later, and I think eyes are really turning to the University of Virginia, which was ranked #1 on FIRE's list in the most recent ranking. And a large part of the reason for that super high ranking is the work of people like Mary Kate and the Heterodox Academy chapter here, I co-founded Heterodox Academy in 2015, and the UVA chapter is, I think it's our second largest, but I think it's our most active and dynamic. It's really extraordinary, the things that are happening at this university. So I think Mr. Jefferson would be proud. All you alumni out there, I think you can be proud. And I think what we saw here tonight with this wonderful conversation between one of the best university presidents we've seen in decades, a man who really embodies what we think of as the purpose and mission of a university with strong, clear, principled leadership, and with Bari, who is one of our greatest cultural innovators. Imagine being, you're still less than 40, is that right? I'm 40. Okay, imagine being less than 41 years old, and already you have founded one of the nation's most innovative universities and one of its most innovative media companies, in both cases responding to the emergency needs of this moment, which is the rising illiberalism on the left and the right. So thank you both for your leadership, your cultural renovation. Now, my job here is just, we had, this day was planned, we had the leaders of the free speech groups. Mary Kate had this really useful algorithm of mixing us all up to talk about 4 factorial questions, and we had really good discussions, and I'll just bring out a couple of points that I hope will add on to what we heard tonight. So the first question was about student-facing programs. We heard from Bridge USA, Manu Meal. We talked about Braver Angels, the Constructive Dialogue Institute. So there are a variety of programs that universities can use to teach these skills. But I think one of the most interesting things to me in that part of the conversation was hearing how at Bridge USA, a student group, they think of themselves as preparing students to be productive in the work world. That is, to be useful to companies. Now, I can tell you, I teach in a business school. I talk with a lot of people in the corporate world. And you'll find a lot of articles about this. The corporate world does not like Gen Z because it's very hard to work with them. It's not a slur on the majority, but so many of them are the sorts of people who think that they have a right to tell everybody what they can and can't say. So these student groups, some interesting things came out. If we think of training students in skills of civil discourse, civil dialogue, and we can somehow give them a credential, a merit badge, something to show that they've had this training, that is going to be a signal to employers, this is a sane person, this is a reality-based person. Yes, we want to hire this person. And if the University of Virginia or Arizona State University, or of course the University of Austin, are known for this, then you have a really good brand. Now, higher ed used to be one of America's top brands until 2015, and then we self-immolated on this overdose of illiberalism. So our brand is in the sub-basement, but schools that commit to this will rise up and have a very, very valuable brand. The second question, oh yeah, let me get the water, thanks. Okay. Okay, the second question that we discussed was actually about the Ron Daniels question that Mitch just mentioned. What do universities owe democracy? And looking over the comments, looking over the things that were said, I think we can think of, so Yuval Noah Harari, I recently heard him on a podcast, he said, democracy is a conversation. It's an unusual kind of conversation, but it only works if it is an ongoing conversation. And so I think that's a very useful frame for saying, what are we doing at a university? I think the answer is we are preparing students who can take part in that conversation because it's a difficult one. It's not a normal conversation. We're preparing them to take part in an unusual, difficult, and essential conversation, and we're teaching them the skills to carry it on and advance it and not shut it down. And that's what was so upsetting to us in 2015, is all the students who were, and aided by some faculty and administrators, who were shutting down the conversation. That's illiberalism. And if you think about the virtues then, and that was a theme that came up in this conversation, the virtues are the virtues of a good conversationalist. And that includes things like curiosity A good conversationalist isn't just going to lecture you. They're curious about who you are and what you have to say. And they have the ability to do perspective taking. And they have the ability to be humble about what they know or who they are. And so in all of these ways, this, I think, is the model of how we in universities can prepare our students for citizenship at this really difficult and kind of frightening moment in American history. We have this duty, we have this obligation. And of course, that's exactly what Mr. Jefferson thought when he was founding this university at a difficult time in this nation's history. The third question that we addressed was, should viewpoint diversity be a part of a university's DEI commitment? Why or why not? And while superficially it would seem easy, well, sure, we want diversity of race and gender and politics. Let's just fit it all in. And some people thought that there might be a way to work that. But I think a number of us thought, no, the DEI framework is fundamentally incompatible for the reasons that Bari talked about. That if you have a worldview based on the victim-oppressor mindset, that's a very particular set of ideological commitments. It's a lens that everything has to sort of be seen through, and that's going to be kind of incompatible with viewpoint diversity. So a lot of us thought a better way to think about it is think about the culture that you're immersing students into and train them to enter that culture as part of orientation. Now, orientation for students is full of checklists. You have to have your alcohol training, you have to have your sexual harassment training, you have to have this, drug training, and nobody cares. I shouldn't say that, but as far as I can, it's a check the box thing to meet legal requirements. But what if when students come in and you have this brief window when they're totally open to becoming a new kind of person, and they're excited about growth and change, and they're open to a new culture? What if we think about it more as like how to be successful here? What are we doing? Why are we here? What are the virtues that you need to be successful here? And it's not just you personally successful, it's pride in this amazing thing we're doing together, and especially if you can do pride in this particular institution, whatever your institution is. So at UVA, there are enormous moral resources to be very proud of this place and have it be part of your identity. So in an interesting way, you almost bring back identity as a very positive force. It's not this pre-given identity that divides us. It's the identity that unites all of the students with the faculty on this mission to create this amazing institution that pursues truth. And then finally, the last question we talked about is, should schools have mandatory free speech orientation for incoming students? And here we thought, we were a little uncomfortable with sort of, mandatory, free speech training just like other kinds. But we thought about it, that some of the conversations were about the importance of culture, of creating a culture. A university is a culture, it has a culture. And part of what has happened, and they talked about at the very end, being social media, culture has always been something passed on from one generation to the next with modification. That's what culture has been for literally hundreds of thousands of years, until about 2014. Once everyone is on social media, and the earlier internet wasn't like this, but social media with its super viral algorithms and its ability to identify a witch and burn her within 24 hours, culture is no longer passed down from generation to generation. It's passed laterally at lightning speed, and this is going to wipe out the continuity of any institution if we don't take control. And so a very important point here is leadership. And this came up here at the end. Leadership. In the corporate world, the CEO, the leader, is responsible for the culture, for the ethical culture, for guiding the culture. Now, university is a different kind of place. The president can't tell the English department what its culture should be. But leadership actually does have a lot of control over undergrad culture. They have more ability to shape sort of the culture outside of the academic departments. And as a closing thought, I'll say leadership in higher ed is more important now than it ever has been, because if you don't control the narrative, if you don't think about your moral resources, if you don't try to channel values and norms and learning and ideas from previous generations down to the current one, then someone else is going to control the narrative, or it's just going to happen online. Our political life is now a struggle to control the narrative all over the place. So I think higher ed leaders need to be much more firm and principled and talk the talk and walk the walk than they had to be, say, 15 or 20 years ago. And this, again, is why I think Mitch has been such a great leader in higher ed. And I think Jim Ryan deserves an enormous amount of credit. When I first met him at John Griffin's apartment long ago, it was clear that he really valued and understood the Jeffersonian legacy of free speech and free inquiry at this university. So I'll just close with a couple of words that I think are really themes for tonight. And that would be leadership, culture, and truth. And when a university gets those right, and you get this virtuous circle between the three of those, then you get a magnificent institution that is a boon to the society. So I think that's the end of our evening. I want to thank you all for your attention, for being part of this community. Thanks to Mitch, thanks to Bari. Thanks. Okay, and all right, good night.